What if the most important words are the ones whispered in the dark, or not spoken at all? Today, we'll share the stories that happened off-screen in the Great Saga. The silent decisions, secret vows, and unspoken loyalties that define the fate of House Stark. Let us know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And now, get comfortable. Picture the cold stones of a castle or the crackle of a fire in a campaign tent. Our story is about to begin. The silence in the chambers was not one that granted peace, but rather the kind that precedes a storm, or perhaps follows it, when the air still trembles from thunderclaps and the earth hasn't yet absorbed the rain. It was thick, palpable, woven from the scent of wax from dying candles, the cold stone of River Run's walls, and the faint, almost imperceptible aroma of river flowers that Catelyn Tully had brought with her into this room, into this new life. Beyond the castle walls, echoes of the wedding feast still lingered, drunken laughter, snatches of songs, the clatter of arms. But here, in the bridal chamber, these sounds arrived muffled, distorted, as if from another world. For Eddard Stark, it truly was another world. All day, he had moved and spoken, as if performing a long-rehearsed role in a play, whose meaning he didn't fully grasp. He stood in the sept, beside the woman promised to his brother. He knelt before her father, Lord Hoster Tully, and accepted her hand, feeling the coldness of her fingers through the thin fabric of her glove. He sat at the head of the table beside her, mechanically raising his cup when someone shouted a toast to their union, to the north and the Riverlands, to victory over the Targaryens. But he himself wasn't truly there. His mind wandered along snow-covered roads, across battlefields where the earth was soaked with the blood of his friends and foes. In this silence, alone with the woman who now bore his name, Eddard felt more isolated than he had in the heart of battle. The journey wasn't over. The war wasn't won. This marriage was just another milestone on a long, bloody road, and what lay ahead was shrouded in a fog of uncertainty, thick and cold like the morning mist over the white knife. Slowly, as if reluctantly, Eddard Stark removed his heavy gray wool doublet, embroidered with a direwolf on the chest. His movements were deliberate, unhurried, the precise actions of a warrior accustomed to campaign life, where every superfluous action was an unforgivable luxury. He carefully folded the doublet and placed it on the oak chest at the foot of the bed. Then he unbuckled his belt, from which Ice, his great sword, was no longer hanging, but the phantom weight of steel still felt heavy on his hip. He laid the belt over the doublet, and the wolf head buckle gleamed dully in the candlelight. He walked to the copper wash basin in the corner. The water in the pitcher was icy, almost like the mountain streams of the north. Eddard cupped a handful and splashed it on his face, washing away not so much the road dust as the weariness of a day filled with unfamiliar gazes, alien hopes, and other people's words. The cold water momentarily cleared his thoughts, pulling him back to the reality of this room, with its high vaulted ceilings and richly decorated tapestries depicting scenes from House Tully's history. He looked at his hands. The skin was toughened from constant contact with his sword hilt and reins, covered with small scars and calluses. These were the hands of a soldier, not a husband. He ran his fingers over his face, feeling the rough stubble. There was nothing of the brilliant southern lord about him, nothing like his brother Brandon. He was a northerner to the bone, a man of stone and ice, accustomed to silence and the harsh realities of life where deeds were valued more than words. He wiped his face with a coarse linen towel, and his gaze fell upon Catelyn. She was sitting on the edge of the enormous bed, her back to him, unbraiding her thick, dark red hair. Her hands moved smoothly, confidently, and in this simple, mundane action, there was so much dignity and calm that for a moment, Eddard imagined she did this every evening in this very room, rather than having just been bound in marriage to a stranger for the sake of a political alliance. She was like a sculpture carved from ivory and sunset, alive and warm amidst the cold stone of his new reality. Suddenly, another face appeared in his mind's eye, the face of his sister, Lyanna. It was indistinct, veiled by the haze of memory, but her eyes, gray like all Stark's, looked back with reproach and sorrow. He remembered her laughter, clear and defiant, her love for riding, her refusal to be a lady from the songs. He remembered the scent of winter roses she loved so much. This memory was sharp, like a shard of glass plunged into his heart. The war had begun because of her abduction, because of the honor he and Robert Baratheon had sworn to uphold. But the longer the war lasted, the more honor became mixed with vengeance, and Lyanna's image with the bitterness of loss. He recalled his last conversation with his father and Brandon before they left for King's Landing. Brandon was full of rage. His fiery wolf's blood boiled. He swore to bring his sister back and make Rhaegar Targaryen pay. Lord Rickard was more restrained, but there was such determination in his eyes that Eddard felt afraid. He, Ned, had always been quiet, the second son, a shadow of his older brother. He had been told to remain in Winterfell, but fate had decided otherwise. Now, both his father and brother were dead, burned, and strangled at the whim of the Mad King. And he, quiet Ned, was leading the armies of the North-South, bearing the title of Lord of Winterfell, and married to his brother's bride. He remembered standing in the Sept at River Run, feeling hundreds of eyes upon him. He saw Lord Hoster's face, stern, but with a flicker of pain in his eyes. He saw the faces of the River Lords, his new bannermen, and he saw Catelyn's face. In her eyes, blue like the waters of the Trident, there was no love, no joy, only resignation and duty. The same resignation and duty he felt in his own chest. They were both soldiers in this war. Their battlefields were simply different. The emotion of that moment was not a newlywed's delight, but the heavy cloak of responsibility pressing down on his shoulders. He felt like an imposter, occupying someone else's place. Brandon's place beside this woman, his father's place at the head of House Stark. And this feeling of guilt and loneliness was colder than any northern wind. Eddard slowly turned from the wash basin and looked at his reflection in the dully polished silver tray on the dresser. A stranger gazed back at him from the gloom, a young man with an old man's face, with eyes in which eternal winter had settled. The war had left its scars on him, not just on his body, but on his soul. It was a constant, aching weariness that never truly faded, even after long sleep. It was the habit of sleeping lightly, startling at every sharp sound, ready to leap up and grasp his sword at any moment. It was the heaviness in his chest that became unbearable at night, when there were no battles or orders to distract him from thoughts of the fallen. He felt that heaviness now, in this luxurious, peaceful room. It was the shadow of the past, following him relentlessly. He looked at the bed, massive, with carved posts shaped like leaping trout, covered in silks and furs. It was a symbol of union, a symbol of the future. But for him, it was another battlefield where he didn't know how to act. He was the Lord of Winterfell, Warden of the North, But in this moment, he was merely Eddard Stark, a man grieving for his family and dreading what tomorrow would bring. He knew he had to approach her, had to fulfill his duty. Lord Tully expected it. His bannermen expected it. The laws of gods and men demanded it. But every step towards her felt like a step on thin ice. He didn't fear her. He feared what she would see in his eyes. Not a lord, not a warrior, but only the shadow of another, more worthy man she was meant to love. He always woke when Lyanna appeared in his dreams. Her voice called to him, but he couldn't make out the words. Now it seemed he heard that call in waking life, and it came not from his sister's ghost, but from the silent woman with hair the color of autumn leaves. Just as Eddard was about to take that first step, yielding to a sense of duty, something unexpected happened. Catelyn, having finished combing her hair, did not lie down in bed as he expected. She rose, and her silhouette against the fireplace fire seemed both fragile and incredibly strong. She walked to the fireplace, picked up the poker, and adjusted the logs. Sparks flew upwards, momentarily illuminating her focused face. In this simple, everyday gesture, there was no coquetry, no pretense. It was the action of a mistress of the house, a woman putting her world in order, even if that world had shrunk to a single room. She didn't look at him, but Eddard felt as though she knew he was watching. She sensed his gaze, his hesitation, and her gesture was an answer. It was a silent message that he, a man of the North, accustomed to understanding the language of silence, read unmistakably. She told him, without words, that she was not a frightened maiden, but his ally, that she understood the gravity of the moment and was ready to share it with him. Then she turned, and her blue eyes met his gray ones. In her gaze, there was no fear or reproach. There was quiet expectation and understanding. She saw not just Lord Stark, but a man upon whose shoulders an unbearable burden rested. And in that moment, the wall of awkwardness and estrangement that stood between them cracked. He suddenly saw in her not merely Catelyn Tully, Lord Hoster's daughter, his brother's bride. He saw a woman who had also lost much. She had lost a fiancé she perhaps loved, or at least knew and expected. She had lost her accustomed world, leaving warm and fertile River Run for the harsh and unknown north. Both of them had been torn from their usual lives by fate and thrown into the crucible of war and duty. And in that, they were equals. This silent exchange of glances, this simple movement by the fireplace, changed everything. It was a hidden event, a tiny shift in the tectonic plates of their destinies that would define their entire future. Eddard Stark stood still, weighing two paths on an invisible scale. One path was simple and clear, the path of duty. He could approach her, fulfill his marital obligations silently, without extra words, as custom required. That would be the Northern way, the Stark way. To save face, to hide feelings behind a mask of stone and ice, to do what had to be done. In the morning, they would awaken husband and wife, the alliance sealed, and no one would dare to fault him. Lord Hoster would be pleased, his bannermen reassured. But looking at Catelyn, at her calm face, illuminated by the fireplace flame, he realized that this path was a path to nowhere. It would lead only to years of polite estrangement, to two strangers living under one roof. He remembered his parents, Lord Rickard and Lady Liara. Their marriage, too, was an alliance, but it held respect and a quiet, deep affection. He had seen how his father looked at his mother, how his stern face softened when she entered the room. They were partners, pillars of support for each other. Could he build something similar with this southern lady? The second path was far more complex. It demanded from him not just an action, but a decisive step. It required him to overcome his own pride, his grief, and his awkwardness. It demanded that he reach out not as a conqueror, but as an equal. He felt drawn to this path, but also found comfort in his usual reserve. Staying in his shell was safer. But war had taught him that the most important victories were won not with a sword, but with will. He remembered the words of his Meister, Wallace, who said that the strongest castle was not just one with high walls, but one with loyal people inside. His marriage to Catelyn Tully was not meant to be just another wall in the North's defense. It was meant to be the heart of that defense, and a heart cannot be cold. He looked at her and saw not only beauty, not only duty. He saw a strength of spirit unbroken by sorrow or uncertainty. He saw what was so valued in the North, resilience. He made his choice, not to take the easy path. He slowly walked towards her, each step echoing in the quiet room. He stopped not at the bed, but before her, at arm's length. He didn't touch her, giving her space, showing respect. He saw her tense slightly, but she didn't retreat. Her gaze remained direct and clear. He wrapped himself in his silence like a familiar cloak, but it was a different silence now. Not estranged, but filled with meaning. He extinguished almost all the candles in the room, leaving only one on the bedside table and the fire in the hearth. The room plunged into a cozy twilight, where shadows danced on the walls, softening sharp features and smoothing angles. This gesture of his was a farewell to the role of the cold lord, to the image of his brother's shadow. He was saying goodbye to the loneliness he had imposed upon himself. He listened to himself, to the new feeling that was stirring in his chest. It wasn't love. No. Love was a word from songs, and he was a man of prose. It was something else. Respect. A premonition of partnership. He understood that before him was not just a woman, but the future Lady of Winterfell, the mother of his children, the mistress of his home. And she deserved more than a silent fulfillment of duty. She deserved the truth. He had to say something that would break the ice between them, that would lay the first stone in the foundation of their shared future. Words came to him with difficulty. He was not a master of speeches like Robert, or quick-witted like Brandon. His words were heavy and few, like the stones of the North. But they were always honest. And then, in that silence, broken only by the crackling of logs in the fireplace and the distant murmur of the river, Eddard Stark leaned towards Catelyn Tully. He did not kiss her. He only touched her hair, which smelled of flowers and smoke, and whispered words meant only for her. He didn't speak of love or passion. He didn't make empty promises of happiness. He spoke of what truly lay between them. He told her he knew she was meant to marry his brother, and that he was sorry fate had been so cruel to them both. He said he saw in her not merely Lord Tully's daughter and a pledge of alliance, but a woman with a strong heart and a proud spirit. He whispered that the North was a harsh land, and it needed a strong lady, and he believed she would be just that. He promised her not love, which he did not yet have, but something greater, something more enduring. He promised her his respect, his loyalty, his protection. He swore she would never be alone in the cold halls of Winterfell, because together they would face whatever fate held for them. These were simple, few words, but in them was more warmth and honesty than in all the wedding toasts spoken that evening. And when he pulled back, He saw tears glisten in her blue eyes, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of relief. That night in River Run, in a room overlooking the river, two strangers, bound by war and duty, ceased to be merely Lord Stark and Lady Tully. They began their long journey towards becoming Ned and Cat. And though new battles, long separations, and unbearable losses awaited them, they had already taken the first, most difficult step. They found each other in the silence. And what could be more enduring than a union born not in the clamor of a feast, but in the quiet whisper of two hearts seeking solace amidst the storm? If you found this story compelling, please give this video a like, share it with a friend, and subscribe for more deep dives into the world of Westeros. Your support helps us bring these tales to life. The evening air, thick and still, settled over the Northern Army's camp, bringing with it a deceptive quiet. This wasn't the kind of peace that brings calm, but the kind that follows thunder, when your ears are still ringing from the rumbles, and the air smells of ozone and the ominous promise of another strike. It was woven from 1,000 muted sounds, the muffled whinny of tired horses, the soft clang of hammers in the mobile forge, the creak of leather, and the whispers of sentries dissolving into the cool mist. For Robb Stark, standing at the entrance to his tent and gazing at the hundreds of lights scattered across the valley, this silence was heavier than any battle cry. Each light represented a life entrusted to him, the young king in the north, and every extinguished light from past battles remained a scar on his soul. The war wasn't lost yet, but the path that had seemed so clear and righteous within the walls of Winterfell had, here in the mud and blood of the Riverlands, begun to branch, tangle, losing itself in a fog of wrong decisions and heavy compromises. Something important had been missed, a thread severed not on the battlefield, but somewhere deep inside, in the silent twilight of his own thoughts. It was the feeling of an unfinished conversation with his father, with honor, with himself. The breath of what was coming didn't feel like a fresh wind of change, but a cold draft seeping through the tightest fastenings of his kingly duty. He felt something shift, but he couldn't yet tell if it was a displacement of his destiny's tectonic plates or just the tremor of tired earth beneath the feet of his thousands of soldiers. Robb entered his tent, unfastening his heavy cloak, damp and smelling of smoke. Simple actions helped to organize the chaos in his mind, to regain a sense of control over the world, even if that world was limited to canvas walls and a few pieces of campaign furniture. He carefully draped the cloak over the back of a chair, making sure the wolf fur on the shoulders wasn't creased. Then he sat at a table cluttered with maps and dispatches. His fingers, accustomed to a sword's hilt, gently touched the parchment on which a map of Westeros was drawn. He traced a finger along the line of the trident, past the twins, and his gaze lingered. It wasn't just a route, it was a knot he had tied himself, a promise sealed by his house's honor. Robb picked up a small knife and a piece of wood from the table, slowly beginning to whittle it. The shavings fell onto the map in thin, almost transparent curls, like the ashes of burned opportunities. It was an automatic, unconscious action, a way to occupy his hands while his mind wandered through the labyrinths of strategy and duty. He wasn't cleaning his boots, but his thoughts, scraping off the grime of weariness and doubt. In the corner of the tent stood his battle armor, dull in the light of the oil lamp. A fresh dent was visible on the breastplate, the mark of a morning skirmish. Rob looked at it, and it was like looking into a mirror that reflected not his face, but his path. A path marked by scars, steel, and blood. He felt the same, resilient, but already dented, still able to withstand a blow, but each time feeling the cold of metal on his skin more deeply. Suddenly, the smell of herbs and boiled water, wafting from the neighboring medical tent, pulled him from his stupor. This scent was alien in a world of iron and sweat. It reminded him of something else, of life that doesn't fight but heals. And with that scent came a memory, not of battle, not of a war council, but of a quiet moment a few days ago. He had entered that tent, looking for the chief meister, but instead saw her, Talisa of Volantis. She was bent over a wounded Lannister boy, her dark hair pulled back in a simple knot, her face fixed in an expression of complete concentration. She hadn't noticed him, the king, standing in the doorway. Her whole being was consumed by her work. She carefully cleaned a ragged wound, her movements precise and gentle, her voice soft and soothing as she spoke to the wounded boy, whose words were lost in groans. Rob froze, watching. In that moment, he wasn't a king, and she wasn't a foreigner. He was just a tired man who saw something authentic and pure amidst the universal madness. The emotion that overwhelmed him then wasn't delight or surprise, but a sharp, piercing longing for a world where humanity's primary purpose was not to take life, but to preserve it. It was a feeling of almost forgotten peace, a sense of home he no longer had. He remembered not the details of her work, but how the lamplight played in her hair, and how for a moment it seemed to him that if he stayed there, in that tent, protected by her quiet strength, the war would end itself. Rob put down the knife and wood. The memory left a tangible trace, a shadow of that fleeting peace, which now made his own tent feel even more solitary and cold. He stood up and walked to the entrance, but not to go out, but to listen. The sounds of the camp remained the same, but now he heard them differently. The hammer's clang in the forge no longer seemed like the sound of preparation for victory, but echoed in his temples as a dull reminder of an endless cycle of violence. He felt weariness, not just in his muscles, but in his very soul, tired of having to be a symbol, a banner, an unyielding rock for his people. Every morning, he woke to the sound of the horn, calling for muster or march, and that sound had become synonymous with burden. But now, standing in the silence, he realized there was another sound, one he had begun to both wait for and dread, the soft rustle of the medical tent's flap, a sound that meant she was near. This thought was dangerous. It was a crack in his armor, a vulnerability he couldn't afford. But the shadow of adventure, as he once perceived this war, now breathed down his neck, not with excitement, but with the cold of inevitability. He was a king, and his path was defined. But deep down, he was no longer sure that path was leading him where he truly wanted to go. He couldn't bear it anymore. The silence of his own tent pressed on him more heavily than any enemy. Rob stepped outside into the cool night and, without conscious thought, headed towards the source of that herbal scent, the infirmary. The flap was ajar, and a soft yellow light spilled from within. He peered inside. The scene was almost the same as in his memory. Talisa sat on a low stool next to a stretcher, where a soldier with a bandaged leg lay. She wasn't attending to a wound. She was simply sitting there, holding a small bowl of broth. The tent was quiet, with only the steady breathing of the sleeping wounded and the crackle of the lamp audible. And in that moment, the subtle shift occurred. Talisa looked up, as if sensing his gaze, and their eyes met. In her gaze, there was no fear or servility, which he was accustomed to seeing in the eyes of his subjects. There was only calm curiosity, and, it seemed to him, a shadow of recognition, as if she saw not the king, but the very man who days ago stood in the doorway, lost and weary. She didn't smile, didn't nod, just looked at him through the stripe of light and shadow. This silent exchange of glances lasted only a few seconds, but for Robb, it became a watershed. This was the shift, the displacement he had felt earlier. An unexpected mark left not on the muddy ground, but directly on his soul. The silhouette in the tent's doorway was his own, yet he suddenly felt like a stranger in his own life, observing himself from the outside. He hesitated to enter, hesitated to speak, afraid of breaking this fragile, weightless moment. He simply stood and watched, and in that gaze lay the beginning of a new, unknown path, leading away from all his maps and plans. Back in his tent, Robb sat at the table, but no longer looked at the maps. Her face stood before his inner eye, and a silent battle began, far more terrifying than any he had waged on the battlefield. On one side, duty weighed on him. He saw Walder Frey's face, heard the old man's creaking voice listing the terms of their alliance. He saw the map on which the twins were the key to the entire North, the key to victory and vengeance for his father, the honor of House Stark, the oath given by him, the king. All of it was carved in stone on his conscience. To go against this meant betraying not only strategy, but the very word of the Starks, the honor for which this war had begun. On the other side was her, Talisa, the memory of her hands healing an enemy, of her calm gaze in which there was no war. She was the embodiment of the peace he so craved. She was the promise of another life, a life where he could simply be Robb, not the king. This was a struggle between icy calculation and living warmth, between the crown and the heart. He felt drawn to the path she indicated, a path where he didn't have to sacrifice people for castles and crossings. But he also knew the price of this path, the risk of losing everything they had fought for, the risk of being called an oath breaker and letting down thousands of people who believed in him. He weighed the fate of a kingdom against the fragile, barely nascent sprout of personal happiness. And for the first time in his life, the scales were balanced. Robb Stark made his decision. It had matured not in the clamor of arguments in a war council, but in this deafening silence, alone with himself. He wouldn't go to the Freys now. He wouldn't send a messenger confirming the alliance. Not yet. He chose not to follow the predetermined path, at least not today. He took a step aside, allowing himself this pause, this moment of uncertainty. He stood up, went to his cloak, and wrapped himself in it, as if trying to preserve the remnants of the warmth he had brought with him from the medical tent. This gesture was a farewell to the old Robb, the boy who believed honor was a simple and clear code, and duty left no room for doubt. Then he walked to the oil lamp and extinguished it with a single motion. The tent plunged into darkness, and only a thin sliver of moonlight pierced through a gap in the canvas. He remained standing in this darkness, listening not to the sounds of the camp, but to the beat of his own heart. He had made his choice, to stay here, at this crossroads, not to rush, to give himself time to understand who he was now. A king who leads his people to victory at all costs, or a man who saw a glimpse of another world and could no longer forget it. In the darkness of the tent, filled with the smell of cooling oil and damp wool, Robb Stark stood motionless. The war hadn't ended, duty hadn't disappeared, and the twins still waited for him on the map. But something had irrevocably changed. The decision made in silence was not a final refusal, but merely a postponement, a moment stolen from fate. But it was precisely such moments, as he now understood, that decide everything. He didn't know if this new, unseen path would lead him to victory or to ruin. He knew only one thing. The gaze of the woman from Volantis was worth the risk, and perhaps the next time he faced a choice between duty and heart, he wouldn't hesitate so long. Perhaps. What do you think Robb should have done? Let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more deep dives into Westeros lore. Have you ever really stopped to think about how silence changes? I mean, how it can go from this really peaceful, comforting quiet to something absolutely piercing, even terrifying? In Winterfell, the silence had totally shifted. It wasn't like it used to be. Back then, it was thick and calm, like a deep snow, blanketing the entire world, just waiting for the spring warmth to finally arrive. It promised peace, promised an awakening. But now, that silence actually hummed. It felt stretched, incredibly taut, like a bowstring pulled back just before the arrow flies. It was heavy, really heavy, full of the scent of old stone, cold leather, and this deep lurking fear you could almost taste. This wasn't a silence for resting. It was definitely waiting. There was no real tranquility there, just the ghost of screams these ancient walls had absorbed, probably forever. Every single corridor, every hall, seemed to hold an echo of something unspoken, a reverberation of a journey that just got cut off too soon. Here, right in the heart of the North, under those chilling banners of the flayed man, history itself just seemed to freeze, unable to take another step forward. Yet, beneath that icy crust of stillness, there was this barely perceptible movement, a faint heartbeat that just hadn't surrendered. Something was forgotten. Yeah, but definitely not dead. Something had been buried, sure, but it still breathed, hidden beneath layers of snow and all those lies. It almost felt like the castle itself was waiting, listening to a wind that wasn't just carrying snow, but actually the very shadows of the past. In this profound quiet, a brand new language was actually being born, voiceless and ancient, and all that was needed was to simply learn how to understand it. In her small, kind of drafty room, she sat right by the dim window, just staring out at the gray courtyard. Her fingers, numb from the biting cold, slowly, methodically, worked stitches into the hem of this dark gray dress. The needle really struggled to pierce the coarse, worn fabric, leaving behind this thin thread, almost completely invisible against the overall weave. It was a monotonous, almost meditative task, honestly, just a way to keep her hands busy and maybe quell that tremor in her body, which, let's be real, wasn't always from the cold. Each stitch felt like a small victory against decay, a tiny, tiny attempt to restore some semblance of order in a world where everything just seemed to be spiraling into an abyss. She wasn't just mending a dress, you see. She was stitching herself back together, her own fragmented memories, and that fragile, fragile hope she still clung to. Her movements were precise, so learned, like those of a servant who was just accustomed to endless repetitive work. She'd smooth the fabric, check the seam's strength, measure out new thread. It was a ritual, definitely, but preparation not for some fancy ball or a feast. No, it was for simply another day that just had to be survived. Every single evening, She would sit just like this with needle and thread, repairing whatever had worn down during the day. Not just her clothes, but, well, her own fortitude. A cloak, hanging on a hook by the door, still held the dampness from a recent blizzard, and its scent, a mix of damp and dust, totally filled the room. She had grown so accustomed to this smell, just as she had to the cold stone flags beneath her feet, and to that eternal, gnawing anticipation of something inevitable. Then, suddenly, the needle pricked her finger. A tiny bead of blood welled up on her skin, and in her mind, like this distant rumble of thunder, a memory just flashed. Not of King's Landing, no, not of the Vale either. This was a memory from here, from Winterfell, from another, almost unreal life she'd once lived. She must have been about 10, I think, sitting there by the hearth in the great hall, trying her absolute best to embroider a direwolf onto a piece of linen. The stitches were so crooked, the thread all tangled, and she was honestly on the verge of tears from pure frustration. Then her father, Lord Eddard Stark, he just sat down right beside her. He didn't scold her for being clumsy at all. He simply took her work in his large, strong hands and said that even the strongest walls begin with a single stone, and the most intricate pattern with a single, even hesitant stitch. She remembered less his actual words than the feeling of his presence, a feeling of absolute unbreakable safety. The warmth emanating from him seemed almost capable of melting any ice. The scent of his leather doublet, the smoke from the hearth, and that freshly baked bread from the kitchens, that, right there, was the smell of home, the smell of a world that just couldn't collapse. The emotion of that moment, so pure and bright, surged with such incredible force that for a moment it actually stole her breath away. This wasn't just a longing for specific events, but this piercing pain from the loss of the feeling itself, that feeling of truly belonging, of being protected, truly loved. And back then, as a child, she hadn't valued that quiet joy. No, she just took it completely for granted. Now, though, a tiny fragment of that memory was sharper than any blade she'd ever seen. She blinked sharply, snapping back to the cold, hard reality of her room. That drop of blood on her finger had already congealed into a tiny dark spot. She brought her finger to her lips, and the coppery taste of iron on her tongue just yanked her right back into the present. The consequences of the past, you see, they didn't just live in her memory. Oh no, they were etched onto her very body, a thin, pale scar on her shoulder, always hidden beneath the coarse fabric of her dress, sometimes ached with a change in the weather, a dull throb. She had learned to ignore it, honestly, just like so many other things. But there were some things that were simply impossible to get used to. Any sudden sound outside her door, hurried footsteps in the corridor, the loud, booming laughter of guards down in the courtyard, the creak of a distant door. It made her heart absolutely seize up, her entire body clench. This was just a reflex, completely ingrained in her by months of pure, grinding fear. The shadow of her recent adventure was long and cold. It lay upon everything she touched, everything she saw. She slept so lightly, waking at the slightest rustle, and each time, in those first few seconds after waking, this icy terror just gripped her until she finally remembered where she was. And even though this place was itself a prison, it was, somehow, different. The threat here wasn't as overt, not as personal, you know? It was diffused in the very air, in the suffocating silence, in every single glance. And this constant, utterly exhausting vigilance had become her second nature, an inseparable part of her existence now, like breathing or a heartbeat. One evening, as the blizzard outside howled particularly fiercely, there was a soft, almost shy knock at her door. It was one of the old serving women, a woman named Oshana, whose face was like a baked apple, all wrinkles, but with such lively, clear eyes. She had actually served the Starks even before Sansa was born. Can you believe that? The woman entered silently, placed a meager supper on the table, a bowl of thin, watery broth, and a piece of stale bread, then moved just as silently towards the exit. But right at the door, she hesitated for a moment. Her hand, hidden there in the folds of her apron, slid to the table and left something else right on its edge, beside the bowl. It was a small, still warm oat cake, from which emanated this faint, comforting scent of baked apples and cinnamon. Their gazes met for only a fraction of a second. In the servant's eyes, there was no pity, no fawning. There was just this firmness, this stubbornness, and something more, a silent acknowledgement. Then she exited as soundlessly as she had come, closing the door firmly behind her. Sansa stared at that oat cake for a really long time. It wasn't just a piece of food, you see. In a castle where every extra crumb counted, where Lord Ramsay Bolton himself feasted on the best, leaving only scraps for others. Such a gift was an act of unheard-of defiance. It was a risk. It was a symbol, a tiny flag raised right there on enemy territory. It was the very first word spoken in that voiceless language she was only just beginning to truly understand. She honestly didn't know what to do. To accept it meant drawing the old woman into a dangerous game. To refuse meant betraying that incredible gesture, that fragile, fragile connection. She sat there in silence, and that small oat cake on the table seemed to be the absolute center of her entire universe. Her whole world had just shrunk down to this tiny object, warm and smelling so wonderfully of home. She weighed every single possible outcome. To accept this gift meant acknowledging she wasn't alone, that within these cold, unforgiving walls, there were still those who remembered the wolves and despised the flayed skin. It meant entering into a secret pact, becoming part of a silent resistance. But what would Oshana face if someone found out? The lash? The torture chamber? Death on the castle wall? The very thought of it just chilled her blood to ice. Her own horrific experience had taught her just how cruel the retribution for the slightest defiance could be. The desire to remain invisible, to literally blend with the walls, to become a mere shadow in order to survive, wrestled within her with a suddenly awakened urge to act. This oatcake wasn't just food. It was a call, a powerful one, a call to return, to remember exactly who she was. Not Elaine Stone, not the faceless wife of some bastard, but Sansa of House Stark, the true daughter of Winterfell. The peace she had sought in her solitude was, in truth, the peace of despair. But this small, brave gesture offered a totally different kind of silence. The silence of conspiracy, of community, of a shared secret. The risk was immense, absolutely, but the reward was great. Not freedom. No, that was still so far off. But the profound realization that her root, her very essence, was still alive in this frozen earth. She made her choice. Slowly, almost as if performing some sacred ritual, she took the oatcake. It was still slightly warm in her cold palms. She brought it to her face and inhaled its aroma deeply. It was the scent of her own childhood, the very smell of the kitchen where old Gage used to bake. the smell of those grand feasts when the entire castle was just filled with laughter and joyful bustle. She took a small bite. The taste was simple, yes, but to her, it was honestly sweeter than any delicacy she had ever tasted in King's Landing. She ate slowly, savoring every single crumb, locking that feeling deep, deep inside. This was her silent answer. She accepted the gift. She entered this secret alliance. When she finished, she meticulously gathered every single crumb from the table, leaving not the slightest trace. Then she went to the window and gazed for a long, long time at the snow-covered courtyard, where the wind swirled snowflakes in this frantic, almost wild dance. She wouldn't go to Oshana. She wouldn't say a single word of thanks. Any word would be completely superfluous and incredibly dangerous. Their language, from now on, was the language of glances, of gestures, and of those small, secret gifts. She extinguished the candle, plunging the room into total darkness. Wrapped in her thin blanket, she didn't feel trapped anymore. For the very first time in a long, long time, she felt not like a prisoner, but rather like a soldier on watch, awaiting orders. She had made the choice not to go, not to flee, not to act rashly, not yet. Her farewell to despair was quiet, almost imperceptible, really. She simply decided to wait, listening to the heartbeat of the castle, which now, incredibly, beat in unison with her own. The very next day, in the great hall, during that dreary morning meal, she saw Oshana. The old servant moved among the tables, clearing dishes, her face as impassive as ever. Their gazes met again, for just a fleeting moment, right above the heads of the Bolton soldiers. There was absolutely nothing in them. No smile, no nod, no obvious sign at all. Nothing an outsider could possibly notice, but in that void, a secret now lived. It was a silent confirmation. I know. Me too. And in this shared silence, the old fear and loneliness were just gone. There was a shared burden, yes, but also a shared hope. Thin as a spider web, yet strong as actual steel. Sansa lowered her eyes to her plate, and there, right on the edge, almost imperceptibly, lay a small piece of dried apple. She then looked at the stone carving above the hearth. A thick layer of soot and grime couldn't entirely obscure the outline of that snarling direwolf. He was still there, you see, still waiting for his moment, even beneath the enemy's banner. And looking at him, she for the very first time wondered not about how to just survive until tomorrow, but about what the next winter would actually bring. Perhaps, just perhaps, next time, everything would be truly different. So, what do you think will happen next for Sansa? I'd love to hear your theories in the comments below. And hey, if you enjoyed this deep dive, make sure to hit that like button and definitely subscribe for more explorations into your favorite stories. Thanks for watching. Could your sworn enemy become the only person you can trust with your life? This isn't a rhetorical or philosophical question. No riddle for the wise. For some, it becomes a brutal reality, forged in the fires of despair and hopelessness, when every other option vanishes like a mirage. Imagine a chilling, bone-penetrating situation. A cold, merciless night, cloaked in impenetrable darkness, somewhere in the middle of the King's Road. Here, there are no familiar castle walls to offer any sense of security. No burning hearth generously sharing its warmth. No familiar faces to bring even a shred of comfort and peace. All around is just the dense forest, seemingly breathing ancient, primal secrets, and the boundless sky, strewn with a myriad of indifferent stars, too distant and uncaring to notice two lost, exhausted souls cast into this wilderness. The sounds of the night are the rustling of dry leaves under gusts of piercing wind, the sharp, sudden crack of a dry branch beneath the invisible paw of some nocturnal predator emerging to hunt, a distant, bone-chilling howl that makes blood run cold. And it is in this frightening, primal silence, broken only by the measured, deep breathing of a sleeping person and the gentle yet relentless crackle of a dying fire, that something occurs which, at first glance, seems utterly unthinkable, contradicting all logic and common sense. Lessons in survival sometimes come from the most unexpected sources, turning into strange, twisted forms of trust when an enemy becomes your only support. Arya Stark. Her name is already almost a legend, whispered from hearth to hearth, somewhere between tales of kings and valiant knights. The little wolf escaped from the gilded cage she once considered home, but which turned into a prison. Yet here, on the ground, amidst the dirt and the forest thicket, she is no heroine of ballads, no object of admiration. She is simply a frightened but stubbornly defiant girl, whom the whim of fate, that merciless force, has bound to one of the most terrifying, most dangerous men who ever walked the wide, dusty roads of Westeros. Sandor Clegane, known as the Hound. A killer, an executioner, a loyal, brutal dog of House Lannister, whose name instilled fear, and now, her unwilling, irritating, but unfortunately, absolutely necessary companion. They sit by a tiny fire, its flame more like a smoldering ember than a true, warming blaze. It offers more the illusion of warmth than real relief from the biting cold. Acrid smoke stings her eyes, making them water, but Arya does not look away. She stares at his broad back, his massive shoulders, at the scar that disfigured half his face, turning it into a living grimace of pain and fury, forever etched onto his skin. Even sleeping, he looks like a monster, ready to break loose at any moment, to lunge at any instant, to unleash his wild nature. And it is this monster, this source of her fear and burning hatred, who is now her only protection against the real monsters that roam in the utter darkness, unseen. It's unthinkable. It goes against her very nature and everything she believes in. Yet it is an undeniable truth. It is a lesson the world teaches her with brutal frankness. The Hound usually takes the first watch. He doesn't trust her an inch of the ground he stands on, let alone his life, for he has seen what this small, wild wolf is capable of. And that feeling, that deep, instinctive dislike, is absolutely mutual. Arya had seen him kill, how he ruthlessly dealt with those who stood in his way. She had witnessed his bestial cruelty, his complete indifference to human life, be it foe or innocent. In her list of those she must kill, Cersei was first, then Joffrey, but the Hound was also there, somewhere in the middle, alongside other names that made her blood run cold just remembering them. Ironic, isn't it? How easily priorities shift when your own hide is on the line, and the only thing that matters is surviving until the next morning. The cold seeps through her thin, dusty clothes like 1,000 icy needles, but the fear of the night shadows, of roaming bandits hiding in the bushes, awaiting their prey, of hungry beasts scavenging for food, is stronger than any frost. This fear keeps her alert, even when her small, exhausted body refuses to obey, when her eyes droop from weariness. The Hound sits motionless, as if carved from stone, a massive rock in the midst of a raging night, impervious to its whims. His eyes, hidden in shadow, scan the darkness, catching every rustle, every faint, barely discernible sound that might betray the approach of danger. He says not a word, makes not a sound. He doesn't need conversations, empty, meaningless words that people love to throw to the wind, deceiving themselves and others. He needs silence, deep, impenetrable silence, which will allow him to catch any danger, any breath that does not belong to them, and safety. Above all, his own safety. For in this world, there is no one who can guarantee it. Arya curls up, trying to find some comfortable position on the hard, cold ground, wrapped in a thin cloak that barely protected her from the piercing wind. Every bone aches from the day's journey, from countless hours spent riding, from sleeping on hard, uneven surfaces that seem to mock her tired body. She tries to close her eyes, but cannot. In her mind, as if on a cursed, endless parchment, images swirl. Robb, Catelyn, Yoren, all dead, all gone, remaining only in her bitter memories, like ghosts of the past. And this man, sleeping a few feet from her, who once served those who brought all this about, who shattered her world, forcing her to lose everything. How can one sleep when your enemy sits by the fire, his massive, menacing silhouette projected onto the wall of darkness, like an ominous harbinger? How can one trust someone you despise with all your soul, whose name evokes only hatred and a thirst for vengeance? But time, that relentless and unyielding dimension, passes. Hours dissolve into the night's gloom, like smoke from a dying fire, carrying away moments. The moon slowly but surely moves across the inky sky, like an invisible ferryman, and the stars change their positions, like unseen guardians watching over the fleeting world. The cold grows more piercing, penetrating deep into her bones, making her shiver all over, despite all her will. Arya feels her eyelids growing heavy, sticking together, her brain refusing to resist this overwhelming desire. Her body demands rest, despite her mind, which screams of danger, of the need to stay awake, of impending threats that could await them at any moment. She hears the hound sigh, heavily, wearily, that deep, prolonged sound, like the groan of an old oak in the wind. Then a quiet, barely audible movement, the rustle of clothing, a dull thud. And there he is, approaching her, his shadow covering her like a shroud, making her shiver. "Your turn," he says in a low, hoarse voice that seems even more formidable and threatening in the piercing silence of the night, like a predator's growl. He doesn't ask, doesn't offer. He commands. It's not a request, but a statement of fact, an unyielding truth of their existence. Arya gets up, rubbing her eyes, trying to shake off the remnants of sleep and clear the fog from her head. Her legs are stiff. Every muscle aches from fatigue and long sitting. She looks at him, trying to discern his expression in the meager light of the fire, but sees only shadows. There is nothing in his eyes but weariness and his usual grimness, deep-set wrinkles, as if burned by pain. No malice, no sympathy, only complete indifference to her suffering. She takes the branch he offers her and pushes it into the fire, watching the flame greedily devour it. Sparks fly upwards like tiny meteors, instantly disappearing into the impenetrable darkness above their heads. The hound drops to the ground, right where she had just been sitting, as if his weight itself pulls him earthward. He settles in, his massive body seeming almost careless in its descent. But in reality, every movement is precise, habitual, as if he has done this thousands of times. Now it's her turn to be awake. Now it's her turn to listen to the night, to listen to the world, to listen to herself. She sits by the fire, hugging her knees, trying to get some warmth from its feeble heat. Her eyes slowly adjust to the darkness, distinguishing silhouettes, shadows, the contours of trees that had previously seemed a solid wall. The fire crackles, casting orange, dancing shadows onto the surrounding trees, turning them into fantastic, distorted figures, like ghosts. The damp night air carries the smells of pine and wet earth, mixed with a light, sharp tang of smoke that settles on her tongue. Arya stares into the darkness, where the forest becomes a dense, impenetrable, living wall, full of hidden threats. There, beyond that wall, lurk all the horrors she had been told stories about, and those she had seen with her own eyes, experienced firsthand, leaving deep scars in her memory. Behind her, the hound begins to breathe deeply. He is sleeping, truly sleeping, peacefully, like a child, unburdened by nightmares. This realization paralyzes her for a second. He trusts her with his life, even if indirectly, even if by compulsion, but still trusts her. If someone comes, she will have to wake him, warn him of the danger, or she could just do nothing. Let fate, that merciless force, deliver the justice she so desires. But such a thought quickly vanishes, dissolving into the night air like smoke, leaving no trace. She is not a killer who murders the sleeping. She is not like that. Her hatred does not go that far. And besides, if he dies, what will become of her? She will be alone. Completely alone in this hostile world, where every rustle, every sound carries a potential threat, where survival depends on unexpected alliances. The sounds of the night become her only companions, her strange, silent allies in this battle with darkness and solitude. The soft snore of the hound, who despite all his ferocity, his menacing appearance, sleeps like a child, peacefully and deeply. His steady, deep breathing, reminding her of his immense, inhuman strength, hidden beneath the cloak of sleep, ready to erupt at any moment. She listens to the beating of her own heart, which seems too loud, like a drum beating a rhythm in the night silence. Listens to the distant cry of an owl, cutting through the silence like a sharp blade, as if a warning of something inevitable. The sound of the wind sweeping through the treetops, like invisible ghosts dancing above them, whispering secrets she will never decipher. Sometimes a branch breaks with a dry, sharp snap, and Arya flinches, gripping tighter the hilt of the knife she always keeps with her, like an extension of her own hand, her only reliable defense. Her hand habitually reaches for the hilt of needle, the small, light sword given by Jon Snow, her brother who was so far away. Her only fragile link to home, to memories of Winterfell, of the family she once had but lost. She remembers all the lessons of Syrio Forel, the sword master from Braavos, who taught her to look, not just see, quick as a shadow, silent as a mouse, deadly as fate itself. The night teaches her other lessons in patience, when every minute seems an eternity and time seems to stand still. Lessons in observation, when every silhouette, every sound, every rustle takes on new meaning, becomes an important signal. Lessons in how to trust instincts, and not just her eyes, which can deceive, and also her hatred, which clouds her mind. Time stretches unbearably slowly, extending to infinity, as if the very fabric of reality is thinning. Every minute feels like an hour. Every hour a whole epoch, full of anxiety and tension. The cold penetrates her bones like a piercing wind, but Arya does not stir, does not allow herself to shiver, trying to conserve every bit of warmth. She is motionless, like a statue carved from nightstone. Only her eyes move, scanning the surroundings, searching for the slightest signs of danger, the slightest movement. She tries to imagine that she is not surrounded by a wild, hostile forest full of threats, but by the strong, familiar walls of Winterfell, which once offered her protection. That behind her is not the hound sleeping, but her father or brothers, reliable, beloved, her own, with whom she would feel safe. But these are just fantasies, sweet but deceptive visions that quickly dissipate. The harsh reality is this: her father is dead, her brothers and sisters scattered across Westeros, and behind her snores the one she should hate, the one she swore to kill, whose name was on her list. And yet, in this strange, twisted order of things, there is its own logic, its own, albeit grim, harmony. He guards her in her sleep. She guards him. Their survival is interdependent, like two halves of a torn whole, doomed to coexist. One cannot deny this simple, yet profound truth, this unspoken agreement. She will never admit it aloud, not even to herself, in the depths of her small, stubborn heart. But it is so. She learns to sleep under his guard, not because she trusts him, not because her hatred has evaporated, but because she has no other, better choice. For solitude in this world is tantamount to death. It is forced trust, born of desperation, not affection. And then she learns to stay awake, guarding him, because it is the only, albeit paradoxical, way for the two of them to live until dawn, to see the next day, to continue their journey. Perhaps it is in these long, drawn-out hours, spent in complete, ringing silence, where the sounds of the night become her only companions, that Arya begins to understand something new about survival, about human nature, about the limits of hatred, that enemies can be useful, like a sharp but necessary knife in hand. That hatred does not always lead to immediate retribution, that sometimes it must be postponed, dulled, in order to survive. That sometimes, in order to live, to continue one's path, to see a new day, one must do utterly unimaginable, unacceptable things to overcome oneself. This lesson is the price of her continued existence, her survival in a ruthless world. The first glimmers of dawn begin to paint the eastern horizon, pale gray, then soft pink, heralding a new day. Night retreats reluctantly, taking with it its shadows, its nightmares, and its secrets, which will remain only between them. The forest slowly reveals its clear outlines, transforming from a menacing wall into merely a cluster of trees, losing its frightening mystique. Birds begin to chirp, timidly at first, as if shy to break the silence, then louder and more confidently, greeting the new day, filling it with the sounds of life. Arya feels the tension that had bound her all night, like icy shackles, begin to loosen, dissolving into the air, giving way to exhaustion. Soon, the hound will wake, and then they will once again become enemies, or at least adversaries, forced to tolerate each other, hiding behind a mask of mutual distrust, returning to their familiar dynamic. But this night was different. It was a night of strange, unspoken truce, concluded between two lonely souls in a vast, merciless world where everyone is for themselves. A night when deep, burning hatred gave way to the instinct of self-preservation, when the logic of survival prevailed over emotions, over the thirst for vengeance. A night when Arya Stark, a small but brave girl who once vowed to kill the Hound, learned to sleep under his protection, under the watchful eye of the one she considered her executioner. And this was, perhaps, one of the most important, most bitter lessons of survival she had ever received, a lesson that changed her forever. Because in a world where every new day brings new dangers, where every step could be the last. Even the most desperate, most unthinkable alliances can become the key to the next dawn, to a new opportunity to continue your path. And so, under the guard of her enemy, to the lullaby of the night, where every sound was a part of her survival, Arya Stark learned to live. And not just to live, but to survive, to become stronger, embracing the paradoxes of this world. If you found this deep dive into the harsh realities of Westeros captivating, hit that like button, subscribe for more character analyses, and let me know in the comments below. What was the most surprising alliance you ever saw in a story?